He thinks that's very important. Tonight at 10:30, join us for a special look at the end of the Vietnam War. It's called The Last Chopper Out.
Business of the wreckage lasts sometimes for the rest of one's entire life.
It is the war that may never be forgotten. I'm Brian Jenkins.
Good evening again. I'm Ross Becker. For the next half hour, we're going to take you back 20 years ago this weekend, the end of the Vietnam War. Tonight, a debate between someone who was there and someone who protested, turning the lessons of Vietnam into a teaching experience and crossing the ocean to escape death, how one family survived. The lucky ones caught that last chopper out of Vietnam. America's involvement in the war it never wanted was finally over. U.S. troops first set foot in South Vietnam in 1965 after Congress wrote President Johnson a blank check known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Within 2.5 years, 500,000 American troops were putting their lives on the line. The president believing all of Southeast Asia would go communist if Vietnam fell. Well, ultimately it did fall. But Johnson's premise proved false, and the result is a legacy of pain and fear and betrayal and confusion that leaves America divided about Vietnam even today.
There is perhaps no more poignant historical event marking the failure of American involvement in Vietnam than the fall of Saigon. You never heard the story told as you're about to hear it. Tonight we look back through the eyes of a man who was on the last chopper out.
April 30th, 1975, the evacuation of Saigon. It's every man for himself. Thousands of panic-stricken Vietnamese clawing at the embassy gates, begging not to be left behind, as the last of the Americans save themselves. If you were there that last day, it was like being at a funeral where all the mourners are trying to kill each other.
I was one of those mourners, an operative for the Central Intelligence Agency. I'd been in Vietnam 5.5 years when the end came. It was one of the most shameful moments I've ever lived through.
The reason it ended this way was wishful thinking on the part of a lot of American officials like myself. Nobody wanted to admit the war was lost, so we waited too long to plan for the exit. The final unraveling began 2 years before with a ceasefire negotiated by Henry Kissinger. It got the last of the American troops out of Vietnam, but left 140,000 communist forces in the South. They wouldn't get out because we hadn't beaten them, and now they turned on the Saigon government itself, a government corrupt, inefficient, riddled with communist spies, possibly as many as 14,000 of them, according to intelligence estimates. That meant the government was like Swiss cheese and about as defensible. In the 2 years following the ceasefire, the U.S. Congress halted all-American bombing in Indochina, and President Nixon resigned because of Watergate. The communists were encouraged. They'd always seen Nixon as a madman and were afraid of him. Now they thought the road to Saigon was open. In early 1975, they began pushing hard. The president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu, panicked, and without telling any of us in the embassy, ordered his forces to pull back in two crucial areas, the northernmost provinces and the Western Highlands. The withdrawal turned into a rout as terrified civilians became entangled in the retreating forces. Within 2 weeks, their communist pursuers sliced the country in two and obliterated half of Saigon's army. It was too much for some of us in the embassy to believe, including Ambassador Graham Martin. He was a cold warrior of the old stripe. He'd lost a son in Vietnam, and he wasn't going to lose Saigon to the communists.
In early April, 4 weeks before the collapse, I briefed the ambassador on the destruction of government forces. He didn't believe me. He said Saigon still had a chance.
In the next 4 weeks, he convinced himself and many in Washington that the communists could be lured into another ceasefire. He refused to plan for an accelerated evacuation, and many of us in the embassy were forced to begin sneaking Vietnamese friends out of the country on cargo aircraft. 4 days before the collapse, in an effort to appease the communists, the ambassador persuaded President Thieu himself to get out of Vietnam.
I drove to a secret air base that night outside Saigon. Tracers lit the night sky. Small arms fire crackled along the perimeters. He'd been drinking and weeping, but he had one consolation. He just moved all of his gold out of the country.
Thew's departure didn't stop the communists. For the past 4 weeks, our intelligence had indicated they would stop for nothing, though the ambassador wouldn't believe it.
2 weeks before the end, I met with our best Vietnamese agent. He drank a beer, he loved Budweiser, and then he told me the communists were going to overrun Saigon by the end of April, bringing in airstrikes and artillery. That's exactly what happened.
On April 28th, communist aircraft bombed the Saigon airbase. And that night, their artillery began pounding the edges of the city. Many of us were thrown out of bed by the concussion. But still, Martin was hopeful. He thought we could evacuate by fixed-wing aircraft at a leisurely pace. He wouldn't even chop down a tree in the embassy courtyard to make way for helicopters. That was a mistake. The landing strips were blown apart. 140,000 communist troops were within a half hour of downtown Saigon. Mid-morning on the 29th, the last day of the war, the White House finally overrode Martin and decided to send in helicopters from the evacuation fleet offshore. This was the signal to evacuate. Bing Crosby singing "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas" on Saigon radio. Inside the embassy, we were so caught off guard by the evacuation order, we didn't even have a master list of the Vietnamese in danger who had to be rescued. So we spent the day rescuing ourselves and whatever lucky Vietnamese could sneak, beat, or cajole their way onto a U.S. helicopter or sailing vessel. At the embassy walls, Marines played God, picking those who would be saved, kicking those back who wouldn't. Remnants of the South Vietnamese Army and Air Force fled into our arms, their aircraft abandoned at sea. The embassy grounds were packed with Vietnamese waiting to be choppered off the roof. I walked among them, handing out water. The heat was unspeakable. The building shook as incinerators gobbled up tons of classified files. The downdraft from one chopper broke open a bag of discarded secrets, blowing them all over the embassy courtyard. The North Vietnamese would later use these abandoned files and others to identify agents and collaborators we'd left behind. Over the radios in the CIA operations room, Vietnamese agents begged for help. They would be abandoned. At one point, a Vietnamese woman I knew called to say she would kill herself and her child if I couldn't rescue them. I couldn't.
She made good on her promise, adding 2 more bodies to those already weighing on my conscience. When my time came to leave that night, we had to push Vietnamese out of the way in the halls of the embassy to get to the chopper on the roof. I couldn't look in their eyes.
Retreat is the most difficult of all military operations, but as a matter of honor, you do not leave friends on the battlefield. In the evacuation of Saigon, over half of the Vietnamese who finally got out escaped on their own, with no help from us. The last CIA message from the embassy declared, "Let's hope we do not repeat history." This is Saigon Station signing off.
It is through the eyes of former CIA officer Frank Snepp that we saw that report. Frank, you sense America is still very much in the dark about what went on in Saigon?
Well, the war is still very controversial, and particularly the way the war ended, because as we had disgraced ourselves in the conduct of it in some respects, so we did in the end. Retreat and defeat is neither a part of American history. It's very, very difficult to admit to yourself that you've lost, and that in the process, you left friends on the battlefield, bodies on the battlefield.
Frank, thank you very much.
Sure.
When we come back, a second thought from the American architect of the war, and we hear from 2 people who still carry their Vietnam passions today.
That's a way to